Good evening and welcome back to our series on Daniel, Hope for the Faithful. We are in lesson 11 tonight, and that is chapters 10 and 11, which are on Daniel's third vision. So, just a kind of a scheduling note. Next week we will be off, no class because Tuesday class has their service day. And then the following week after that, we'll have a final class in which we'll do chapter 12 or most of chapter 12 and a wrap up where we'll go back over the themes of Daniel. So that's what's coming up in 2 weeks. So last week we did chapter 9, Daniel's prayer. So someone revisit that for us. What was important about Daniel's prayer and what do we learn from it?
Daniel is praying for things that he is not necessarily guilty of. He's praying for his people, and the second he makes this prayer, God sends out the word to give him understanding.
Yeah, we saw that Daniel repented, but Daniel was righteous, right? He's presented all the way through the book as upright, blameless, and yet he goes and he repents on behalf of his people. So we saw that that is a holy action. That's something that God's people can do, is repent on behalf of their group or their neighborhood or their city or their race in a way that is good for us and has power in the spiritual realm, because that was what triggered that response from the spiritual realm. Yeah. What else?
We had a lot of sevens and lots of different numbers that don't necessarily align with historical records. So we weren't quite sure what was going on there.
Right, we did. We worked on that, didn't we? So God, he said he read Jeremiah's text that it would be 70 years and then the exile would be over, or the time of Babylon would be over, or the loss of the temple would be over. And all of those things were different. That 70 was used in different passages to describe slightly different situations, but all of them were like the initial hardship would last about 70 years. And so we saw that number was symbolic, 70 meaning a time of fullness, 7 times another time of fullness, 10, so 70, a long generation's worth, not a short time that they would be in exile, but a long lifespan worth of time that they would be in exile. So we saw Daniel prayed about that. He said, God, you promised you would send us into exile if we insisted on disobedience, and you were faithful to do that. Also be faithful to rescue us at the end of that time. So we saw that for that symbolic period that Daniel predicted a return. And it is coming up that Cyrus has a decree for them to return. We're going to touch on that tonight. And so Daniel used that, he appealed to God's nature, to God's faithfulness, to God's mercy, and said, bring us back, rescue us. And then we saw the angel come and say,
No, it's 10 times that.
Yes, 70
times 10. Yeah.
times 7, as we saw in the law. It was, if they don't repent, I'll increase it sevenfold. So yeah. 70 times 7, and that 490 was just as symbolic as our 70, right? It wasn't exactly 490 years, but we saw that it was this extra long span of time, this multiplied span of time. And then that whole period culminates in the story of Antiochus Epiphanes and the desolation of the sanctuary. And then the end of that is the reconsecration of the sanctuary. We saw that. Okay. So that ties into what we're doing tonight, right? Remember chapter 7 with the 4 beasts? That culminated in the little horn who spoke boastfully, and we saw that was Antiochus Epiphanes. And then in chapter 8, we had the two animals. What were they? Anyone remember?
One is a goat, and the other
Yes.
one was the ram. Yeah.
A ram and a goat. The goat has the one horn that was Alexander the Great, breaks off 4 horns that were his 4 generals. And then out of that, the small horn that brought the desolation of the sanctuary, also Antiochus Epiphanes, right? They culminated at the same point. Then in the kind of vision or prediction that the angel brought after at the end of Daniel's prayer in chapter 9, we saw the ruler who is to come and the prediction of the desolation and reconsecration of the sanctuary, also the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So all 3 of those visions sort of, ended in their climax was at that same point, this time of the sanctuary, Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay. Those 3 visions we are going to see are or 2 visions and an angel visit, right? And then we got a 3rd vision tonight is going to parallel all that same history. It is all still going to culminate in the time of the desolation of the sanctuary, period of Antiochus Epiphanes. We're going the same place tonight that we've been going in each one of these visions. So any other comments on last week or in sort of the lead up to this week?
There was
time's the charm.
It both is and isn't. It's in some ways I don't find the telling of this vision all that charming.
Well, yeah, but he heard it once, he heard it again, and now he's hearing it a 3rd time. And it's all the same, different, slightly different details around it.
Yeah, good point. And Bethany, you were saying something?
Yeah, the other really big thing revealing last week was that there's this, there's a fight on earth, but there's a heavenly battle going on at the same time. And this questioning of how long will God allow this to happen, because it's damaging his heavenly realm.
Yeah, he is at war with alongside the saints. His host of heaven are at war alongside the saints. Yeah, we saw that in chapter 8 when it talked about some of the host of heaven were swept down. We saw that in chapter 9. It talked about it, and now we're going to see it really pronounced again in chapter 10. Yeah, we're headed there tonight too. Great point. Well, I want to start out tonight by reading all of chapter 10. So it's quite long. If someone wants to read all, that's great. Otherwise, let's break it into 2 halves and have someone do like 1 through 14.
I'll read it.
Thanks.
In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict, and he understood the word, and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for the 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the 1st month, I was standing on the bank of a great river, that is the Tigris. I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like burly, and his face like an appearance of lightning. His eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground. And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright. For now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humble yourself before your God, your words have been heard. And I have come because of your words. The prince of the king of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the king of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the later days, for the vision is for days yet to come. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Would someone read 15 through 11:1?
While he was saying this to me, I bowed with my face toward the ground and was speechless. Then one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. Again, the one who looked like a man touched me and gave me strength. Do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed, he said. Peace, be strong now, be strong. When he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength. So he said, Do you know why I have come to you? Soon I will return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go, the prince of Greece will come. But first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. No one supports me against them except Michael, your prince. And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him.
Okay, thank you. All right, so when is this? So let's go back to verse 1. I wanted to kind of look at that as a whole because there are some doublets in there where things are repeated, and we're going to kind of take them in pairs. But when is this vision set?
In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia.
Okay, 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So Cyrus began his reign in Babylon, right? He became king of Persia 20 years before this, but he became king in Babylon when he took over Babylon in 536 BC. 539 BC. In 539 BC, I have this written down because, it's hard to do this stuff without seeing it written, I think. And let me have a moment to share my screen for you. There it is. So 3rd year, so Cyrus became king over Babylon, conquered Babylon in 539. So the 3rd year of that reign would be around 536, depending on how those years are counted, when he starts reigning, how they count those things. And the weird thing about this is that the last verse in chapter 1 tells us Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So we go, well, then what happened after that, right? He remained there until the 1st year, and then what? Well, it seems that then what is he remained there some more. And so why is that written that way? Well, let's look at it. In 538, maybe this 1 year later, Cyrus had a decree that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild. Oops, that was not what I meant to do. Return to Jerusalem and rebuild. And so we might have expected Daniel to get to go back when some of the Jews went back, but they didn't all go back. And so, and we know there was a great Jewish diaspora that remained in these lands. The story of Esther is set in Persia long after that, and they didn't return. Lots of Jews did not return at that time. And so it seems like maybe Daniel is in the group who is still left in the foreign lands. So Daniel is in 536, if we read this correctly. The interesting thing is that we've talked about how remember the first verse of Daniel is that in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim of Judah. That's probably not when the first deportation happened, to match that up to the historical dates. And yet we've seen over and over, Daniel keeps a consistent internal chronology in the book. And that is 70 years before. 606 BC, the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, is 70 years before 536, the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So I think we may be seeing something that has theological meaning here, right? That's something where we're looking at Daniel, and now 70 years after the captivity or the time of Babylon began, it's been 70 years, but here Daniel sits still in the foreign land. And you notice who was called Belteshazzar. We haven't heard that Babylonian name for Daniel in many chapters, have we? It's been quite some time since that's come up. Remember, he was given that name. It was determined for him by the captain of the guard in chapter 1. He didn't get to pick that name. That was a name of captivity, a name the Babylonians imposed on him. So we see him still in the foreign land, still called Belteshazzar, a name of captivity determined for him 70 years later. And so there's a sense of sorrow that suits the original kind of target readers of Daniel, the Jews in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, who are saying also to themselves, boy, it's been all these years, and we're still suffering under evil, beastly kings. And Daniel, we know, points to all that time in between and says, still remain faithful. So I think that's what we're seeing in the way this dating is done and the way the times are put together. Does that make sense? And any questions on that?
Yeah, it does. And one of the reasons he might not have gone back is he was, late teens, early 20s when he went to Babylon. He's now about 90 years old. He might have been too old to travel,
Yeah, he has had that long generation as predicted, so that he is a very old man at this point. Another thing that occurs to us as we see that he, at the end of chapter 8, remember, he's exhausted and lay ill for days, and then he goes up and returns to the king's business. He may be important to the king's administration. They may not want him to go back. So we have a lot of things that we could speculate and say maybe that's why he remains in Babylon. What else?
I'm not sure what their retirement plan was back then.
Until you die.
Yeah, or just till you're just too old to function. I don't know. Sometimes you see the people that work the longest are the people who are in these they're in important roles, the Supreme Court justice who just keeps on keeping on, or, we see this sort of pattern.
They're also, they're kind of white collar jobs where you're not doing physical labor, which, you don't have to be in the best of health to do, but it also is not as taxing on your health to do those things. And it just,
Yeah. Well, and we know from Daniel's refraining from choice food that he had access to choice food. Like he probably had better nutrition than your average captive in Babylon, right? And so he has seemed to live a long life, and God has been with him, and he has found success over and over in everything that he's done, and so that he's well off in his way, and yet he's still a captive in the foreign land.
Well, yeah, in some way too, he's going through all of this, and he's been describing to kings or explaining to kings that they're in their position because God put them there. So if God put them there and he's serving the king, he's doing God's work right there, which would be another reason to not be like, all right, I'm done, and go home.
Yeah. He seems to have a job to do in receiving these visions as well, right? It's a burden on him, and yet it seems to be a calling on him as well. Yeah, great point. So verse 2, what has Daniel been doing?
He's been mourning for 3 weeks.
Mourning, yes. I think I saw Becky say fasting. You were muted, but I think I read
said morning.
Okay, morning. Fasting. He's fasting from what?
Rich food and wine.
Yeah, rich food and wine, just like he did in chapter 1 when he determined not to defile himself with the choice food and the wine of the king, right? And so that was a choice towards holiness, towards dedication to God, and we see he is repeating that fasting right now. What is the purpose? What is he aiming for with this morning?
Well, verse 1 says he'd been given a revelation and the understanding in a vision, and that got to him.
Yeah. So I think it's I think verse 1 is giving us the summary statement for what the whole 2 chapters worth of vision is going to be, and it's telling us that we're about to hear the vision. I don't think there's a vision before he mourns and a vision after, but that your point is still, that to the same point, like he was already mourning after these previous visions, right? These were very hard on him. He was exhausted and ill for days. He was disturbed. He was troubled.
And people in his lifetime, nobody's going to go back to the temple.
Yeah. It was bad news. The angel brought him bad news, right? And that it was quite difficult to hear and hard on him, right? And so he's mourning. And also look ahead to verse 12, because the angel says something about his purpose. What does the angel say his purpose was that he set his mind to?
To gain understanding and to humble himself before God.
Yeah. So we saw his humility in the previous chapter. He continues in that way, and also to gain understanding, right? He's preparing for continued revelation. He's asking for it, but he's also preparing his heart for it. And this will turn out to be a theme that shows up in apocalyptic literature, where the person who sees the vision prepares his heart for it. Which makes sense. What happens with the companions in verse 7?
They flee in terror.
Right? And what do they see?
Nothing.
Yeah, they experience something, and maybe they see something, but they don't see the vision that Daniel sees, right? Because his heart is prepared and theirs is not. It reminds us of maybe Saul on the road to Damascus, right? The companions see a light, but they don't see Jesus. They hear a sound, but they don't hear the words. And so the people with Daniel cannot hear and see as much as he can. His heart is prepared. Right. We'll also notice, yeah, go ahead.
He mourns for 3 weeks. And it says in, where is it? In verse 13, the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. So while Daniel was fasting, perhaps this is that 21 days. While Daniel is fasting, the angel is detained and finally gets to him.
Yeah, I think that we're meant to consider those are the same 21 days / 3 week period. Yeah, exactly. And notice what time of year this 3 weeks or this 21 day period happens. What time of year is it? Verse 4.
The first month.
Okay. The first month of the Jewish calendar is when? You don't have to know this.
I would guess in March, because the Roman calendar started January, and it's much, much later that happens.
Okay, exactly. So the Jewish New Year happens around the Feast of Passover. So the first month of the year is Nisan or Aviv. It starts with the new moon. And then the 15th to the 21st of that month are Passover. So what has Daniel been doing during Passover feast?
He's been fasting.
He's been fasting. It makes sense because the feast is a celebration of God rescuing from captivity. And here he is in captivity. And so he is mourning, he is humbling himself before God. He's fasting over the period of Passover. So that with that ask, rescue us like you rescued us from Egypt. Yeah. What does Daniel see in his vision, starting in verse 5?
A very crazy man with lightning eyes and, well, fire eyes and lightning. What was it? Very bright. I don't know what Uphaz. What is Uphaz? I don't
It's
even know if I'm saying
a place where they make really good gold stuff.
Is that how you pronounce it? Uphaz?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
A belt from a gold belt of Uphaz. Yeah, it's a region where they make good gold, and not much is known about it. Same with this beryl or chrysolite. It's named after the region it's mined. It's a gemstone. So what's the commonality here? Gold, gemstone, lightning, flaming torch.
Shiny and bright.
Shiny,
Heavenly.
right? Exactly. This is a shining being.
He has an aura.
Yeah. He's wearing linen, which the priests' garments were made of linen, right? Linen is a garment for holiness. Revelation pulls on this description and it uses it to describes a person who is in the Revelation vision represents Jesus. And we see all of these elements of like shininess and holiness. This is a shiny, holy present, right? And so we might think like, are we looking at a pre-incarnate Jesus here? And some like early interpreters did think so. But we're going to see this person is a messenger. An angel means messenger, right? This person talks, as Chris mentioned, about being delayed, well, and needing to be rescued. I guess that could still happen to Jesus because it says the angels would attend him so that he wouldn't strike his foot against the stone, when he's even being tempted. And yet, I think what we're seeing is he comes with a message that we're looking at an angel. And now we get a clue as to why people are always falling on their faces terrified when they see angels, right? Because, wow, they are really impressive looking. And it may be that this is the kind of being that Daniel saw when he saw his previous angels, and now he's giving us this description. It's a picture of awesome holiness. So Daniel, and how does he react, Carrie? As we usually see with angels, how does Daniel react here?
He falls down and eventually goes to sleep.
Yeah, he has no strength left. His face is deathly pale. He's deep sleep with his face to the ground, right? We saw this in when he first met Gabriel, kind of that fugue state, that overwhelm of interaction with God, right?
Almost passing out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, or a trance, or yes, somewhere in that realm. We talked about how that reminded us of the state Adam is in when God makes Eve. We saw how it reminded us of Abraham.
Yeah, Abraham. Uh-oh.
Deanna, you've frozen, I fear.
Faces are pale, they're deeply troubled. Daniel's been ill with being disturbed from his vision.
You've been frozen for several seconds.
I hate it when that happens. Okay, well, Daniel, face to the ground. How does the angel treat him?
He touches him.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. Touches him and gives him strength. What does he tell him? You who are
Very esteemed.
highly esteemed, greatly beloved, it's the commendation from heaven, right? It's so kind, it's so encouraging. And he stands him up, right? He gets him on all fours and then stands him up again. We see a little section of this in 10 through 11 and another in 15 through 19, where Daniel has no strength and the angel repeatedly gives him strength through touch and brings him up. He also calls him to carefully consider these words, right? He touches him on the mouth because Daniel is going to testify to the vision that the angel gives him. And so he has encouragement, strength that he will need, and a call towards being strong and understanding, seeking to understand this vision. Okay, Chris mentioned this. What has triggered the angels? The angel's been dispatched to go to Daniel. What triggered that? Verse 12.
Wasn't it his prayer?
It was his prayer, right? Daniel's words that he started when he started mourning and fasting 3 weeks ago are what caused the angel to come. I have come in response to them, verse 12. But what happened? What delayed him 3 weeks?
He was delayed by the battle with the king of Persia.
Yeah, the word prince is used and the word king is used. This word, the prince word, is used in different ways, in a couple of different ways in Daniel. And one of them seems to be of some kind of high level of spiritual being, some kind of being. In this case, does it seem like it's a good guy?
Mm-mm.
No, it seems like this is the enemy. Right? There is some spiritual being who is an enemy who they're calling the prince of the Persian kingdoms. And then what?
Michael helps him out.
Mhm.
Yeah, we learn a new angel, right? One of the chief princes, we would call an archangel, came to help him. Whatever battle this angel was having, Michael took it over. So this angel is free to come to Daniel. What are we learning about the spiritual realm here?
There are battles.
Yeah. There are battles that we don't know about. To Daniel, he has been fasting for 3 weeks, and what did it seem was going on in heaven?
Nothing.
Nothing. Radio silence for all that fasting. And yet here we learn that the entire time that heaven was active on his behalf So we've learned here that we don't always know all that's going on in the heavenly realm, right? What else? I guess there's good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
In the surrounding Near Eastern cultures, there was a view that there were various gods over separate nations, and when earthly armies clashed below, it was believed that the heavenly armies of these respective deities clashed above. Well, that's not the picture in Scripture, but the picture in Scripture is related, right? We see understanding of Yahweh God, the God of Israel, as the one God, but presiding over a host, as is talked about in Daniel 8, or a heavenly council. That are sometimes referred to as gods. We would put that little g, or sons of gods, some spiritual beings. And it sometimes sounds like God has chosen to represent Israel. God's own self is the representative for Israel, and that maybe there are other spiritual powers representing other nations, right? Prince of Persia. Later, it mentions the Prince of Greece, and so we think, like, well, what's going on there? Well, seem to be some kind of powers that are associated with earthly powers, some kind of spiritual powers associated with earthly powers. In Isaiah 24:21, God says he will bring justice against both spiritual and earthly powers. He says, in that day, the Lord will punish the powers in heaven above and the kings on earth below, as if there is a battle in heaven that parallels the battle on earth. And in 1 Corinthians 10:20, when Paul is talking to Christians about pagan practices, he says that when pagans sacrifice food to their gods, we would put that a little g, that they're actually sacrificing to demons. So it may be that there are spiritual forces who take advantage of the honor that is given to these false gods and act with spiritual power out of that. We're getting a view that somehow there are spiritual beings who are against God and God's angels who are in conflict, and those conflicts parallel the conflicts on earth. Now, how much of this is metaphor versus reflecting the actual actions of literal spiritual beings? What do you all think?
We know that Satan exists and he's doing work here. I think there was even, I don't know where it would be, but I know at some point somebody had suggested that in the Bible, like there were other beings that fell with him, because he's supposedly like stirring up this trouble here, and
The
so,
accuser and his angels.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot
The
of
Satan.
yeah,
The Satan means the accuser.
Yeah, the accuser and his followers are cast out. So there are two sides to this.
Yeah. So it may be that kind of this understanding in terms of princes, like maybe some of this is just trying to explain what's going on in the spiritual world in the way we can understand, because we can't really understand it. But we do know that there are some real forces, right? In Ephesians 6:12, Paul says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So we don't know how all this works, and it doesn't seem like, maybe they would tell us more if it were important for us to know how it works, but we do know there are spiritual forces that are against the people of God as we live out the purposes of God. And that was going on in Daniel's time. And according to the New Testament, that's relevant to us as well. So I think, we see that here It's good to remember because we sometimes forget that we live in a world that is not just what we can see. And I think the last point out of that was really striking to me is that prayer, Daniel's prayer, his fasting, his humbling himself, was a real force that made a difference in that unseen conflict. So it encourages us to pray and to participate in God's work in that way. Questions or comments?
Daniel is just one person, but it seems that his prayers affect the entire realm of the diaspora. He's praying for the people.
Yeah. Is it because he's special, or is it because he was willing to be humble and to pray for the entire people?
Yes.
And might we also have an opportunity to have a big effect if we're willing to be humble and to submit, our repentance to God on behalf of our neighborhood, our city, our race, our nation, There's a sense of the power in being willing to be God's purpose, God's person for God's purposes. Yeah, great point. Well, let's go on to chapter 11 because there's a lot to cover there. Did y'all read chapter 11 ahead of time? Did anyone give it a go? Because it is a doozy.
Yeah, I gave it a good college try. I didn't make it all the way through because I was having to read footnotes to make things make sense. And
I was reading it. I was like, oh, maybe I just need it on audio. And I'm like listening to it on audio. And I'm like, maybe I better try reading it. It just wouldn't stick because it's so cryptic until I started hearing what it's doing, right? So it goes on and on. It is so long. We're going to take a sample and hear how it works. And then we're going to skip ahead. Okay. So, let someone read verses 2 through 4. We'll get oriented to where we are in history. Becky, great.
Now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parceled out towards 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others.
Yeah, okay. So what we're figuring out here is, where are we in history? Did anyone hear something that sounded familiar?
A little horn, 1 king after the 4, and then he will become the 4 winds, which is the 4 generals that are split.
Yes. Okay. So the 1 king is not the little horn, because the little horn comes later, but the central horn on that beast, that the center horn, and then 4 horns growing in its place. Yes, we are echoing that same thing. Who is the 1 king? Anyone remember a name?
Was that king?
It was Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where we are in history. The mighty king whose empire will be parceled out into 4 is Alexander the Great. Remember, that went to his 4 generals. Here it says not to his descendants. He died of a fever at the height of his power without leaving an heir, although it turns out that he had a wife who was pregnant, and then the baby was used as a pawn for a time, and then they were all murdered, and all the intrigues, right? So this, okay, we get in verse 2, there's more kings in Persia and then a wealthier one. There's some telescoping there because there's actually 13 kings in that section. And so we're getting kind of a symbolic sort of, compression of that. And then we get to Alexander the Great. And that is really recognizable as Alexander the Great. Then picking up in verse 5, you remember the 4 kingdoms that we looked at. The 2 that we focused on were the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. These were the most powerful and the most active, and they're the most relevant for the story of Israel. Okay, the Ptolemies, they are based in Egypt, they originally controlled the land of Israel. So where is Egypt compared to Israel?
South.
South. So these are the kings of the south in the section starting in verse 5. When we're talking about the king of the south, it's one of the successors on the Ptolemies, right? All of that there's a bunch of them, but it's all the Egypt Ptolemies king, sub kingdom. Okay, then the Seleucids, they're based in Syria, which is just to the north of Israel. So these are the kings of the north. The Seleucid kings are Seleucus the first and second, and so on, Antiochus the first and second, and so on. So all, there's a chain of kings. They're all the kings of the north. And, with one of the great powers to the north of Israel and one of the great powers to the south of Israel, it's predictable that Israel is in the grinder constantly, right? Okay, let's look. We're going to look at just 5 through 8 and kind of show how this storytelling mode tracks with history, how it works. Okay, verse 5. The kings of the south will become strong. Okay, this is Ptolemy the First, who had been one of Alexander's generals, and he first took Egypt and the land of Israel, right? Continuing in verse 5, along with one of his commanders, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion, and his dominion will be greater than his. And a dominion greater than his. Okay, this was Seleucus the First. He was originally given Babylon, but a rival took over, and he fled to Egypt and served as a general under Ptolemy the First, hence one of his generals, right? Ptolemy, king of the south, actually helped him regain his territory in Babylon, and then he expanded to Syria and controlled Syria all the way to Babylon and had an even more extensive territory than Ptolemy, a dominion greater than his. See how that line fits? And then they started having some conflict over territory, right? Skirmishes over land. Verse 6. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. All right, they're going to make an alliance to a marriage, aren't they? Ptolemy the First and Seleucus the First made an alliance and sealed it with the marriage of a daughter of Ptolemy to Seleucus's heir, Antiochus the Second. Okay, so the daughter of Ptolemy was named Bernice. She comes to the north to marry, but he's already married. And per the treaty, he has to divorce his wife, Laodice, and ensure her sons don't inherit. Okay, so Antiochus II and Bernice marry and have a son. Verse 6, continuing in verse 6, but she will not, it's talking about Bernice here, retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, or along with her royal escort, and the one who sired her as well, her father in the south, as he supported her in those times. Okay, what happened was when Bernice's father, Ptolemy, died, Antiochus reunited with his original wife, Laodice, but Laodice, she's been once burned, right? He put her aside once, and so she murders him with poison. And then she hands over Bernice's baby boy, and their Egyptian attendants, her royal escort, right? The ones who brought her in, and to be killed. And Laodici's son, Seleucus II, takes the throne. Verse 7, but one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. This is one of the descendants of Bernice's line, her family line, will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. So Ptolemy in the south, Ptolemy III, is Bernice's brother, one of her family line, as that line says in verse 7. He takes the throne in the south and decides to avenge the killing of his sister by overrunning the Syrian kingdom. And he plundered the Seleucid fortresses Seleucia and Antioch. He put Laodice to death, and he captured a bunch of territory. Verse 8, also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. Captivity to Egypt, key words, right? And he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of North for some years. Okay, when he plundered those fortresses, he took back silver and gold. He also plundered some temples and took metal images, god statues, idol statues from temples, and he took them all back to Egypt as spoils of war. But he didn't completely subjugate the Seleucid Empire. He weakened them, and he was weakened enough that there's a period without war. Okay, y'all, that was just the first 4 verses. It goes on like this for 148 years worth of Ptolemy Seleucid conflicts. There are 6 wars in this period. And all of this text here in chapter 11, going on and on through it, is all highly tracking to historical details that we know from other sources, including the Maccabees and Josephus, book 12. So it goes through all these wars. Questions on how this chapter 11 thing works. It's like, if you just try to read it, it makes no sense. But if you know all the history, you're like, oh yeah, I see what they mean by that. I see what they mean by that. Like it tracks. Questions or comments?
It seems to be the refrain is, but only for a time.
Yeah, because it keeps going back to wars. And what you have, and then it will point out, and then this happened in the beautiful land, or that happened in the, some of the people of the covenant, right? So what it's, we got just a tiny history of Alexander the Great, even though that was just as significant and detailed a period of history. But what we're doing is we're focusing in on this Ptolemy Seleucid conflict, because that is what is going to affect Israel so greatly. And that's what's going to culminate in the desecration of the temple. So we do verses 5 through 20 is that 6 war period, that 148 years. And then in verse 21, we're going to transition. Okay. We're targeting in on the period we're most interested in here, right? He will be succeeded by a contemptible person. Any guesses as to who the contemptible person might be?
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Antiochus Epiphanes. Exactly. This period from 21 all the way through 45 is focused on Antiochus Epiphanes. We're really zeroed in on him, right? We have moved the microscope like way, way close into this period of history. It says he has not been given the honor of royalty. Okay, we remember he was not in line to be king. Remember, he was a son of the king, but he was in Rome as a hostage until his brother ascended the throne. His brother was scheduled to be king. His brother ascended the throne. Now he's not a valuable hostage anymore. And the brother's son is going to go be a hostage in Rome. But as soon as Antiochus Epiphanes is released, the one who ascended the throne is murdered. Antiochus becomes king as co-regent with his nephew, but he also gets murdered. Basically, everyone around Antiochus gets murdered, leaving Antiochus the king, right? So then when it's, He will invade, he will seize it through intrigue. That's all these assassinations that put him on top. What'd you say, Paige?
Oh, I just said it's just interesting, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, not a coincidence, right?
I think I saw this on HBO called Game of Thrones.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is the kind of thing that any like political intrigue, like deep back and forth story is based on, right? That's why we have these stories like Game of Thrones, and it runs just like that. And it's really just as disturbing if you actually know all the details. People are killing everybody, right? So that's what, and you see this intrigue is mentioned here. You remember deceit and intrigue are mentioned in these parallel descriptions in chapter 7 with a little horn, chapter 8 with a little.
Uh-oh. Lost Anna again.
As arrogant, and he's described as untrustworthy because of
Okay, we lost you when you said chapter 7 and chapter 8.
Verse 22, a prince of the covenant will be destroyed.
Yeah.
My connection was unstable. Verse 22, a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. This is probably that legitimate high priest who was murdered in the Jason and Menelaus, like bribery for priesthood schemes. Remember those? And the legitimate high priest got murdered. That's probably the prince of the covenant here in verse 22. And so all this tracks with the history that we know. Verse 25 through 28 are about Antiochus' first invasion of Egypt. And he goes south. He has a war. On the way back, he plunders the temple in Jerusalem. That's kind of the start of his abuse of Jerusalem and the people there. All the while, he is promoting Hellenization, and he has people who are on his side with Hellenization, forcing the Greek culture and Greek gods on the Israelites. And then 28 through 35 are about his second campaign to Egypt. Notice verse 30. What is your? He's stopped because of ships of where?
Kittim?
Western coastlands.
The western coastlands. Those are the two ways it's translated. This word kingdom. This is the word for Rome. So this is actually the rise of Rome is starting to get involved here. You remember he was a hostage in Rome for a time. So Rome is starting to become a world power. We know Rome is going to be the next world power after all the Greek powers, right? Rome got involved. The Ptolemies made an arrangement with them. It resulted in a major humiliation for Antiochus Epiphanes, which, as he's on his way home, he takes it out on Israel, and it results in massacres, selling people into slavery, destruction of the temple, the stopping the sacrifice, the abolition of the sacrifice, the making of Judaism and the practices thereof illegal. Remember, circumcision is forbidden, keeping the Sabbath is forbidden, feast days are forbidden, and then the abomination that causes desolation in verse 31 here of 11, which is where a Greek idol is set up on Yahweh's altar, and unclean animals are sacrificed to Zeus in the temple. So this deeply profane use of Yahweh's temple is the culminating abuse for the Israelites, the abomination that causes desolation. Notice 32 through 35. Let's back up to 31, get oriented, because this is the climax of, this is the worst of the worst, right? The armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice that's been going since they rebuilt the temple, since Cyrus let them go back and do it. They will set up the abomination that causes desolation, and with flattery he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant. These are Jews who are cooperating with the enemy, right? Those who have violated the covenant. Covenant people who have turned against the covenant. But the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Another camp of Jews who are for violent resistance, for armed resistance, right? And then here's our third camp of Jews. Verse 33, those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered, and when they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. It's going to be a confusing time, right? Some of the wise will fall so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. So we have these three groups of Jews, some who have gone over to the Hellenizing party, though some who've cooperated with the Seleucids, the others who know their God and resist. And then there are these who are wise, right? Those who are wise are a key group in the book of Daniel. This is who's providing the book of Daniel kind of content, right? They're wise enough, they have insight or understanding, key words in the book of Daniel. They are looking for God's timing, they're waiting for God to act, and they're remaining faithful while they wait, though they will suffer and fall, be plundered, fall by the sword, burned, or captured, right? But it is all so that they can be refined, be made pure until the time of the end, right? So we're starting to get, we have this time of the end. That means the end of the desolation that causes, the abomination that causes desolation, the end of the desolation of the sanctuary, reconsecration of the sanctuary. We also are starting to see language that's the time of the end, maybe another end, end not just to this evil, but the end of all evil. So we're getting some overlap in there right here at the end of the vision in 11. So starting in verse 36, we have the end of Antiochus's reign. Chapter 9 said, in this many mornings and evenings, number of sacrifices, the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. We have this idea that Antiochus, his reign, God is going to bring it to an end. And the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and say unheard of things against the God of gods. He's the only one who puts himself up as a god in this period, right? Epiphanies, God manifest. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, and then for what has been determined must take place. Okay. This is kind of a turning point here. I told you this chapter 11, all this cryptic history, nonetheless, clearly tracks with historical record all the way up to this period, where in verse 40, we start to get details that don't match what we know of history. And so like it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle. The king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships and invade many countries. So it starts talking about this, but at the very end of Antiochus's reign, he is not having a great battle in the south. He's having skirmishes in the north. And it talks about how he will be very rich, and yet he was strapped for funds in this region, in this period. His treasury was depleted, not overflowing. And it talks about verse 31, he will fall at the beautiful holy mountain. And yet he died in Egypt, not in Israel. So some readers have said that already we have transitioned into talking about a future leader at the end of days whose details will match these details, not Antiochus. And yet it's hard to make sense of that because there's no break in here that makes us think we're not talking about Antiochus anymore. So that's why many scholars date the writing of this book right to this period. And what they say is that, let me see if I can explain this well. They say that the writer, inspired by God, is telling a God's eye view of history looking back by putting it in the voice of Daniel looking forward. It's told as a prediction, but it's actually a review of history as they know it, as it's already happened. And that the putting it in Daniel's voice is a literary device. And then looking forward, rather than like a prophetic prediction, what we're picturing is a fitting end for Antiochus according to God's promises. And some of the phrases here, like that he'll fall on the beautiful holy mountain, are sort of pulled from scriptures, like Isaiah and Ezekiel call for the fall of God's enemies on the mountains of Israel. And so he's saying Antiochus will get an end as he should, and he's saying a way it will look. And then it happens, but not quite in this way. And so the details don't match up, but God's faithfulness does match up. God does bring an end to Antiochus. He brings an end to the desolation of the sanctuary and the suffering of God's people. Antiochus dies of an illness, just like Alexander the Great did generations before, right? Because in the end, when the time comes that God is going to make that happen, it's the appointed time, and God does make it happen. The Maccabees rise up and take back the temple, and they reconsecrate the sanctuary and the altar, and they rule Israel for a time. And then we get, beginning in verse 12, at that time Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, we're starting to sound like the end of all times, right? Will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and contempt, and those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. And so this is the close of this vision. It closes with Antiochus meeting his end. It tracks with history, except that slice at the end, which is kind of done a little bit differently. And yet the focus is on the faithfulness of God. And overall, this final vision of Daniel is a picture of the world battling. The world is acting like the kings and the kingdoms are in charge. But the wise know all along that God is really in charge. And so the wise watch and pray. They prepare themselves for revelation. They humble themselves and repent for their people, and they wait for God to bring down evil kings. And ultimately, they wait for a final time when God will bring down all evil altogether. And so we're looking at it from our time going, okay, well, we're still in a time of waiting. We still are waiting for the end of evil. We don't have Antiochus, but we've got a lot of evil. And so there is a call for us to be wise, to watch and pray. Any questions or comments on this one? Yeah, Bethany.
I have, has there been any thought that maybe the king of the north is kind of a foretelling of Rome? Just kind of reading through some of that and how, they just kind of go through all the lands. Maybe it's just kind of more of an overshadowing that's going to take place.
So maybe not yes and no. So when you get into the details, especially you get to the details stopping the sacrifice, like it's so specific that they're like, well, it's obviously a picture of this period, this slice of history. It matches up so perfectly that it must be a picture of this slice of history. And yet, like even the ships of Rome, right, come like they're a character in the story as well.
Right.
And yet, right, these stories, they happen over and over. The ruler who speaks boastfully and who attacks and who succeeds through intrigue and who oppresses the people. Like, we could put in some names probably from any period in history, right, including today. And so, yes, it does fit Rome. And it's why Revelation pulls on all this same imagery and uses the Babylon,
Mhm.
but they're really talking about Rome because same.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, just some of the language in that very last paragraph is like maybe there's a shift and and at the time of the end. So Antiochus is done and Rome is gonna come in.
And then there's another.
Yeah. I mean, that's just kind of how I've read some of that, but I do understand your pinpointing that they don't line up.
You can read it that way. And this is, there are scholars who read it multiple ways. I'm kind of trying to present sort of what I think is a middle of the line understanding. But boy, it's pretty controversial, and you can see why, because you could make a lot of different things of it. And yet the theological point is the same, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah. Other questions or comments? I want to wrap us up because I see that we're way over time. This was a long lesson. I didn't go as fast as I planned.
Well, it's a big chunk.
It is.
Thorough.
Mm-hmm.
We skipped a lot, y'all.
We did.
We did.
A lot of history.
And I was really glad. I was like, I think this is fair. I think it's fair to skip this, Next week, so when Jesus talks about Daniel, and Jesus refers to Daniel, right? He talks about it. He doesn't, say that it's not about this other thing, but he also talks about it in terms of pointing to the future. And so we're going to talk about that in next lesson, 2 weeks away. And we're going to talk about this sort of the ideas that prefigure the last day. So all of that plus the themes of Daniel in our final lesson in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad you were here to explain all of this because I read it and I was like, we seem to be going in circles and I'm not following anything.
Me too. And it's because they were going in circles or back and forth at the very least. Yeah.
Well, all of history does that.
Good point.
Yeah. You're like, it's this again. Got it.
Yeah. Wars and rumors of wars is how Revelation puts it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Bible is very cyclical as well.
It is in that we keep going back to our old natures, but it also points to an end that God is purposeful and bringing us to, to end in a new creation. It's not just going to go around and around forever like reincarnation or something, right?
Well, no, there's definitely an evolution in the cycle, but it's you can see the cycles, I mean, you've got the Exodus, the Jews that are in Exodus, and then it's repeated here because they were breaking the laws, but then it's like God is doing it again, but he's making it better and he's making it the ultimate.
Yes, the ultimate rescue from slavery comes. Right. Jesus rescuing us from the slavery of sin, and then completing that rescue when he comes again. Great point. Okay, now I'm really going to stop the recorder and we'll do prayer list.